village of Obili, nestled in the shade of green hills, has always been a quiet and peaceful place where life flowed at its own pace. Here, among the yellow fields and dense forests, people knew each other from childhood, and every day was like the one before. Markets, children's laughter, endless conversations about rain and harvest, family and health. Every corner of the village had a familiar routine, and only the river flowing among the trees reminded them of the unpredictability of life, like nature itself, which could change the world in an instant. The village market, the heart of its life, was always full. From early morning, women laid out fresh fruit, yams, and kava on rugs, prepared for sale. Their hands, accustomed to hard work, tirelessly sorted through the goods, as if each item was a part of their lives, a part of their history. The men who rushed to the market haggled and bargained over the price of palm wine, discussing the latest news from the fields. On this day, the market was particularly noisy. The village children ran around the stalls, playing their funny games, oblivious to the concerns of the adults. The sun was high in the sky, its golden rays penetrating through the trees, filling the atmosphere with incredible light. It was hard not to notice how much the village itself had changed that day, as if nature itself sensed that something important was about to happen, something that would change everything. And then she came. Ashalugo, inconspicuous but at the same time inevitable. She appeared on the horizon as if the earth itself was giving way to her. Stepping on the ground, she seemed not to move, but to float like a mysterious shadow appearing against the backdrop of everyday life. She was not like everyone else. It was impossible to tell where she came from, but it was impossible not to notice her. Ashalugo did not attract attention with bright clothes or excessive ostentatious luxury. Her clothes were simple, an old yellow piece of fabric tied tightly around her waist, wrapping her slender figure. She carried only one small bag with her, and everything in it was a mystery. But there was a hidden light in her that attracted the gaze of everyone who saw her. The whole atmosphere seemed to dim when she appeared, and for a moment the world around her became brighter and more intense. Her skin glowed like it was carved from bright brown stone, soft and warm to the touch. The lines of her body moved with amazing grace, as if she were part of the flow, part of nature. But it was her eyes that caught the eye the most. Her eyes seemed to be imbued with some ancient wisdom, a whole world hidden within them. They needed no words to reveal their secret. It was they that stopped everyone in their tracks, becoming the magnetism that made all other eyes follow her every move. The men, long accustomed to the women of their village, could not take their eyes off Ashalugo. Even the old men, bent over by years and hard work, straightened up to look after her. Young men forgot their games and their children, stopping to enjoy her presence for a moment. The women also felt something strange. For them, as difficult as it was to admit, Ashalugo was not just a woman. She was something more. She did not attract attention with overt gestures, nor did she seek to win anyone's heart, but her presence was so strong that no one could escape her magic. Among all the villagers, one woman stood out in particular, Mama Ema. At 75 years old, she was the backbone of the village, the person everyone turned to for advice. Mama Ema knew everyone by sight, knew who had arrived in the village, and when would return from distant lands, who would move to a neighboring village. She was the queen of observation, the keeper of all information, and no one could escape her watchful eye. Mama Ema sat in her shop, watching everything that was happening as always. When her gaze fell on Ashalugo, she felt something strange. It was not something she could explain in words. It was more of an intuitive premonition, a cold feeling that this woman carried something important with her, something dark and mysterious. Ashalugo approached Mama Ema's shop, but she did not rush to strike up a conversation. Mama Ema looked up at her, and without looking away, she said calmly, "My name is Ashalugo. I'm looking for a place to stay for the night." At first glance, her words sounded calm and ordinary, but they couldn't leave anyone indifferent. The tone of her voice, its velvety depth and mystery, were mesmerizing. Ema's mother studied her face, but despite all her experience, she couldn't explain why she felt uneasy. Various thoughts raced through her mind, but they all boiled down to one thing. Something was wrong with this woman. But despite this, she showed Ashalugo the way to an empty hut by the river. This hut had been empty for a long time after the old Idku died there. Inside, there was only an old straw bed and a few broken pots. Ema's mother couldn't explain to herself why she had sent Ashalugo there. When Ashalugo left without looking back, she left behind a slight feeling of unease that lingered in the air like the trail of a lit candle that had not yet burned out. The women of the village went about their business, but not as they had before. Something was not quite right. With each passing day, life in the village of Obili became stranger and stranger. Ashalugo, who had settled in an old hut by the river, gradually began to influence the villagers. This influence was subtle but noticeable. At first, no one paid much attention to it, but gradually the changes became more obvious. It wasn't just the men who were changing, but the atmosphere of the village itself. Ikena, a successful farmer and head of his family, was the first to notice the strange changes. Within a few days of visiting Ashalugo, he began to notice that his life had taken on a new tone. Nika, his wife, who knew him as a hard-working and calm man, began to feel that her husband had become strangely excited. He returned home in an unusually good mood, with a bright, energetic look in his eyes. He forgot about his old worries and his anxiety about the future. He began to easily cope with the work in the fields, which had previously taken a lot of strength. One day, after Ikena returned from the fields, he approached his wife tirelessly and with ease and offered to help her with the housework, which was a rare occurrence. This caught Niki's attention, who noticed that her husband seemed to have become more attentive and caring. But his transformation was not only external. Ikena seemed to be transformed, becoming more confident, with many ideas and plans that he considered important for the future of their family life. He even began to sing in the field, which had seemed impossible before. At the same time, the old and respected Obina, an elderly farmer with a bad back, became much younger despite his age. His constant back pain disappeared, and his movements became free and easy. This effect became noticeable even to the most cautious and distrustful villagers. When Obina, who usually could not get up without help, brought a basket of yams to the market and carried easily through the village, his sister and neighbors could not believe their eyes. They did not recognize the old man who could barely move. As the men continued to visit Ashalugo, their condition became more and more noticeable. They became younger, healthier, and stronger. Their daily lives took on a whole new rhythm. Those who had previously been ashamed of their physical shortcomings now led active lives, played sports, and reconnected with old friends and family. Their laughter grew louder, their work in the fields faster and more productive. Ikena's home became brighter and more joyful, and his children began to see a new, stronger, and more confident man. But what surprised the women was that these changes were not temporary. With each passing day, the men became more attractive to their wives. Suddenly, they began to realize that their husbands had become better than they had been before. It was a mystery to them. How did this happen? Why had their husbands suddenly become so attentive, lively, and full of energy? The women began to notice how they themselves were starting to feel calmer, as if their husbands had become some intangible and magical source of strength. Despite these changes, the process of visiting Ashalugo remained a mystery. The men were reluctant to share their experiences or even explain what exactly they found in her hut. There was no talk of any specific actions. Ashalugo herself asked for nothing in return, neither money, gifts, nor services. She simply listened, without interfering in the conversation or asking questions. All the men who visited her returned from her hut with a sense of relief and inner peace, as if someone had lifted a heavy burden from their shoulders. Nevertheless, the more time the men spent with Ashalugo, the more they changed. These changes were not only physical, but also spiritual. They became more open, less shy, and more willing to communicate with those around them. This applied not only to their families, but also to their neighbors and colleagues. Old friends and acquaintances began to notice that the men were suddenly starting to care about those they had not thought about before, showing more warmth and attention to those around them. The men of the village began to show unprecedented care for their wives and children. Some became more attentive in their daily lives, began to take care of their families, and took on more responsibility. There was more joy in their lives. And although they did not realize why this was happening, their behavior changed dramatically. The effect was so strong that no one could ignore it. However, Ashalugo was not just a healer, nor was she just a woman who brought change to the hearts of men. Everything that was happening seemed to hide a deeper mystery that no one could explain. This made some of the women, including Mama Aima, feel uneasy. Although Ashalugo behaved calmly and friendly on the outside, her presence in the village seemed to disrupt the normal flow of life. Everything was too perfect, too cloudless, and it was unsettling. Meanwhile, the men, who had become significantly healthier, more determined, and more active, continued to visit Ashalugo. Each visit seemed to strengthen their power and confidence. The women began to discuss among themselves what was happening. Some claimed that it was all too strange, that such power could not be a mere coincidence. Opinions about Ashalugo were divided. But she continued her life as if unaware of all this, calmly continuing to receive the men and leaving them with incredible changes in their lives. The changes Ashalugo had achieved seemed inexplicable. She seemed like a simple village woman, unremarkable among the others, yet her influence caused men to open up, become stronger, kinder, and wiser. But no one knew what was behind these changes. And perhaps this was only the beginning of what was to come in this small village. With each passing day, the changes in the village became more apparent. The men were changing, they became stronger, more energetic, kinder, and more attentive to their wives and children. But against the backdrop of these obvious changes, the women who were observing what was happening began to feel a sense of unease and suspicion. Every morning, when they went to the market, they were surprised to see how cheerful and responsive their husbands had become, how they had forgotten their old worries and complaints. Men who had previously shown little interest in the home now tried to help with the housework, clean the house, and work in the fields with redoubled energy. It was too much, too fast. Women, always more sensitive to changes in the lives of their loved ones, began to sense that something was wrong. At first, they welcomed the changes. After all, for many of them, the attention they were now receiving from their husbands was long overdue. Husbands began to do more for the home, showing more care and love. However, the longer these changes continued, the stronger the feeling of unease became. They began to notice that their husbands had become strangely radiant. There was something unusual in their eyes, something that made the women wonder. The men began to seem less burdened by their inner problems, the worries that often weighed them down in their daily lives, work, debts, children. But it all seemed too perfect. The women who had initially welcomed the changes now felt a sense of inner turmoil. Emma's mother was the first to sense this unease. Although she tried not to show her doubts, she still felt that something was wrong. She was a wise woman who had been through a lot, and she had seen many stories in which women from her village had fallen victim to unexpected changes. Emma's mother knew how to read between the lines. She could sense when something was wrong. But most importantly, she knew that something had changed in the village with the arrival of Ashalugo, and that worried her. The women began to talk among themselves. At first, they couldn't believe that the change in their men could be connected to one woman, to Ashalugo. But with each passing day, more and more of them noticed that since her arrival, the men had changed beyond recognition. They used to be tired, irritable, sometimes rude, but now they were all full of joy and energy. Even old and infirm men like Abina seemed younger, with no more pain in their joints and moving with ease. In the evenings, the men returned home with smiles on their faces, and their wives could not understand where they had gotten this inexplicable strength. This was alarming. The women began to whisper among themselves, wondering what could be behind it. The men had changed too quickly and too easily. They became too happy, too carefree. Some of the women began to feel that their husbands were no longer their husbands. Instead of being with them, they began to live a different life, one in which there were no longer any old worries or anxiety. It seemed that the men had forgotten everything about their past. And then rumors began to spread in the village. The women began to unconsciously eavesdrop on their husbands' conversations and listen to their footsteps at night when they returned from Ashalugo's hut. All these signs could not leave them indifferent. The husbands did not talk about their visits. Their return was always quiet, sometimes silent. And the more time passed, the more the women felt that they did not know their own husbands. Nika, Ekena's wife, became particularly anxious. She loved her husband, but his changed behavior caused her growing confusion. He had become calmer, although he had always been a little nervous and anxious, often worrying about the future, the harvest, and his family. He had always been the main breadwinner, and his anxiety had always affected the whole family. But now, after his returns from Ashalugo's hut, he seemed like a different person. His speech was full of optimism. He stopped worrying and began to look at the world with an ease that had not been there before. But there was nothing wrong with that. At least that's what she thought at first. But when he became more caring, more attentive, and his attitude toward her became sincere and warm, Nika began to sense something strange. Her husband had changed, and she couldn't understand why it was happening so quickly. He started behaving towards her in a way he never had before. But Nika also felt that there was something more to it than just a simple desire to change his life. Anxiety began to spread to other women when they started to notice that the men they had always been able to count on were becoming mysterious and unpredictable. Women who had previously kept their emotions under control now began to realize that their husbands had become less predictable and their gazes had become distant. The men did not talk much about their meetings with Ashalugo, but they all returned with a new light in their eyes. as if they had discovered something great and secret. The problem was compounded by the fact that none of the men could or would explain what was happening. They seemed content and happy, but it was difficult to understand what was behind their behavior. The women began to feel a growing unease, their hearts filled with anxiety because they sensed that their men were not the same as they had been before. All this became more obvious as time went on. Emma's mother continued to observe events with a wise eye, remaining cautious but not interfering. She knew that many of the changes in the village were unnatural, and despite all her wisdom, she could not understand what was behind them. The women continued to whisper among themselves, and the time came when their confusion and unease turned into real fear. With each passing day in the village of Obili, it became increasingly difficult to ignore what was happening to the men who had visited Ashalugo's hut. The initial signs of change, their improved health, glowing eyes, and unusual energy began to turn into something much more disturbing. The strange occurrences that no one could explain began to affect the entire village community. Usually healthy and energetic men began to unexpectedly lose strength, as if an invisible hand had squeezed their physical condition. Ikenna was the first to experience this change. He had always been an example to others, a successful farmer, a kind-hearted husband and father. But a few days after another visit to Ashalugo, his body began to fail him. At one point, while working in the field, Ikenna felt a sharp pain in his chest. His breathing became irregular, and his heart beat wildly, as if it were about to burst out of his chest. He fell to the ground, gasping for air, trying to understand what was happening to him. It was impossible to understand what exactly had caused the pain. It seemed that all his energy, all the strength he had accumulated over years of work, had disappeared in an instant. He couldn't get up, and even after he was lifted off the ground, he felt weak, his body losing its usual steadiness with every step. Meanwhile, rumors spread throughout the village about other men who had visited Ashalugo and experienced the same strange symptoms. Heart and breathing problems became common among those who had visited her hut. Oban, an old farmer who had always suffered from back pain, had a seizure that shocked everyone. The relief he had felt after his first visit was now replaced by a complete loss of control over his body. His frail, perpetually hunched body suddenly stopped moving altogether. He couldn't get out of bed. His joints wouldn't obey him. Despair overwhelmed him when he realized that his strength was gone, as if it had been irretrievably drained from him. The condition of the young men also began to deteriorate. Chisholm, the leader of the village youth, a former athlete who prided himself on his strength and endurance, found that his muscles no longer worked as they used to. He tried to get up after a night's sleep but couldn't move, his legs as if bound by an invisible force. This was especially noticeable during his morning run, when he was usually the first on the village road. But now his legs would not move, and when he tried to force them to move, his muscles began to ache as if they had just been stretched to their limit. It wasn't just the men's physical condition that had changed. Their mental state was also disturbed. For several days after Ashalugo's visit, many of them began to experience panic attacks and anxiety. Ikenna, who had previously been calm and level-headed, became constantly anxious. He couldn't stay at home. His thoughts became chaotic. He began to look at his wife anxiously, as if he didn't know what to do with her, as if he didn't know why all this was happening. There was horror in his eyes. He could no longer find peace in his life. And despite his family's support, he couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had come over him after his encounters with Ashalugo. Obina faced similar problems. Despite his old age, he had always been strong and wise. He was no longer interested in village life. He couldn't concentrate on his work. He couldn't think about the future. All his thoughts were consumed by the feeling that something had changed, but he couldn't understand what. He turned more and more to the woman who now seemed to be the only person who could answer all his questions. But Ashalugo remained silent, as if she knew that her role in these changes was to remain quiet and inconspicuous. The men suffering from these changes were increasingly losing their sense of reality. Their lives were becoming alien and incomprehensible. Every time they tried to do something familiar, it began to seem impossible. Those who had once been renowned for their strength now sat alone, consumed by thoughts of what had happened to them and why they could not return to their former lives. Their best years were gone, and now they could find no comfort. A feeling of emptiness and loss enveloped them. This state of affairs continued for a long time, and although they continued to do their work in the fields, their actions no longer had the same strength. The women who had recently admired these men now looked at them with concern. They saw how their husbands had lost their former steadfastness, how their faces had become paler and their hands weaker. Every step, every movement seemed difficult and laborious. Even physical work in the fields, which had once been easy for them, became a heavy burden. But the strangest thing was that none of the men could understand what had happened to them. They tried to explain their condition to themselves, but could find no logical explanation. Ekena continued to work in the field, but every step was difficult, his shoulders unable to carry the usual weight. He began to forget what had happened a few days ago. His memory seemed to be fading. It became unbearable, and he found it difficult to understand how quickly life had turned into this nightmare. Soon, even stranger events began to occur. All the men who had visited Ashalugo's hut began to experience inexplicable physical pain, so severe that it was impossible to ignore. They lost their strength, their muscles were paralyzed, and their consciousness sank into an abyss. This was only the first stage, but the most terrifying changes were yet to come. With each passing day, the changes taking place in the men of the village of Obili became more obvious and alarming. At first, it seemed that everything that was happening was just a coincidence or a temporary phenomenon. But when such changes affected almost every man who had visited Ashalugo's hut, the question became more pressing: what power was hidden behind her presence in the village? Women began to notice that their husbands were becoming stranger every day. The men's behavior was not only physically altered, but also mentally they lost their former connection with reality. While the men were mostly preoccupied with finding answers to what was happening to their bodies, the women began to watch what was happening with caution, sensing that something darker was behind all these changes. Aima's mother, the only one who was not under Ashalugo's influence, began to listen more closely to her intuitive feelings. A look of alarm often flashed in her elderly eyes when she saw the men returning from Ashalugo's hut and gradually becoming strangers to themselves. Aima's mother couldn't understand what was going on, but her experience of village life told her that some kind of outside influence was at work. She sensed that Ashalugo was not just a casual visitor to the village, but something that brought not only healing, but also destruction. More and more women began to suspect that Ashalugo was not just a strange woman with mysterious powers, but they couldn't understand exactly what was behind her behavior. Aima's mother finally decided to go to Ashalugo's hut to try to find out more. She walked through the village alone, trying not to attract attention. Approaching the river, she noticed how quiet and peaceful the hut was. A strange silence reigned around it, as if the whole world had frozen. Aima's mother stopped at the threshold and stared at the small building for a long time before deciding to enter. When she was inside, the air immediately seemed unusual to her. The strange smell that hung in the air was faint but strong enough to alarm her. It was dark inside the hut, and the dim light of the oil lamp gave the impression that time had stopped here. Ashalugo sat as if waiting for her arrival, looking at the old woman with a gaze that held neither malice nor fear, only cold calmness. Mama Aima felt her heart begin to beat faster. There was something supernatural here that she couldn't explain. With every step she took in the room, the feeling of pressure only grew stronger. Aima's mother couldn't understand how she should behave. Everything in this hut evoked a strange harmony, but at the same time, something inside her told her that this harmony was not so safe. She asked herself why the men who entered here did not return the same. Why did their bodies and souls change? And who was behind it? Ashalugo didn't say a word, just kept watching. There was something elusive in her gaze that made the old woman feel vulnerable. All she could do was feel that Ashalugo knew she was there, and that gaze was much heavier than any words. Aima's mother couldn't wait any longer. She knew that if she didn't solve this mystery, with each passing day the village would be consumed more and more by the evil that had come with Ashalugo. A feeling grew in her heart that this woman was not just a healer, as the others believed. She was something more than just a strange stranger. Ashalugo carried within her an unknown power, hidden behind her calmness and silence. And now the village was beginning to realize it. But it was too late. The power that emanated from Ashalugo was not ordinary. It affected not only people's physical condition, but also their souls. Ashalugo had a unique gift. She could influence men, take away their worries and fears, and give them strength. But she could also take their lives, leaving only their shells behind. This was her secret. Every man who visited her seemed to fall into her trap. Changes took place in their bodies that seemed like healing, but in reality, it was an illusion. In exchange for the energy she gave them, she took their life force, their soul. And these changes were not just physical, they affected the very essence of a person, destroying their inner world. When Mama Aima finally understood this, she realized that the village was on the brink of destruction. Ashalugo was not only destroying lives, but also subjugating the souls of men. It was not just magic, it was a true dark art. She manipulated their will, using their fears and weaknesses to bind them to her and ultimately consume them. These men were no more. Their bodies remained in the village, but their spirits were gone, taken away by Ashalugo's power. She turned them into empty shells, no longer capable of thinking or feeling as they once had. Aima's mother was determined to stop her, but she knew it would be difficult. Ashalugo possessed not only strength but also wisdom, hidden in her eyes and her calmness, in her behavior. However, she now understood that Ashalugo had not come to the village to help. She was here to take over the village, its people, and possibly the entire district. And now the village had to face this threat. The next morning, Mama Aima went to the village to warn the other women. She knew she couldn't keep this secret to herself, that the village had to know what had happened. She began to gather the women, explaining to them that Ashalugo was not who she claimed to be, that she was using her powers to manipulate the men and rob them of their souls. She told them about what was happening in the hut by the river, and how the men were losing their strength and vitality. The women began to realize that their husbands and brothers had become strangers, as if their souls had been stolen. But despite the growing unrest among the women, it was already too late. Ashalugo was too powerful. The secret had been revealed, but it had already left its mark on the village. And now the question was not only how to stop Ashalugo, but also what would happen to the village after her dark power was banished. Several weeks had passed since Ashalugo left the village of Obili. All that remained of her was like a footprint in the sand, washed away by the first wave. But the consequences of her presence remained forever, in the memories of those who had witnessed her magical power and destruction. The village would never return to what it was before she came, and this realization became a heavy burden for all the inhabitants. The men who had been in Ashalugo's hut never recovered from what had happened to them. Ikenna, like the other men who had experienced her influence, continued to suffer from inexplicable physical and mental anguish. His body never fully recovered. He became even more withdrawn and lost in his thoughts. Like the other men, he understood that he had lost something important, something that was gone forever. With each passing day, he grew more distant from his family, his children, and his wife, even though he tried to continue living as before. But something was lost, something irretrievable. They began to live in the shadow of what had once been part of their existence. The men of the village began to withdraw from life, becoming mere shells of the people who had once been full of strength and vitality. Their laughter became quieter, their voices more subdued, and their movements slower, as if their bodies no longer had the energy they once had. Aima's mother, watching what was happening, understood that the village would never be the same again. Although she was one of the few who had not succumbed to Ashalugo's influence, she felt her own life changing too. Her tireless observations and investigations into what was happening to the men could not prepare her for what followed. Everything in the village now felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, as if the earth itself, nature itself, permeated with dark energy, had lost its former peaceful rhythm. Although Ashalugo was gone, her presence continued to be felt everywhere. It was not just magic or a supernatural influence that could be explained as a simple phenomenon. No. Ashalugo had left her mark on the hearts of all those who had fallen victim to her, on the souls of those who could not escape her influence. And this mark was not only physical, but psychological. The men, now freed from her power, could not return to their former lives. They had lost something important, and a return to the way things were was impossible. When the time came for the harvest festival, the village felt empty. The women, even those who had not lost their husbands, could no longer enjoy the simple pleasures of life. The noise of the market, the children playing in the streets, it all seemed like part of some other reality. The village was no longer filled with the joy and laughter it once had been. Now, amid the laughter and conversation, there was a sense of loss. Every face in the market, every glance they exchanged carried memories of the past, of what had happened, of what had disappeared, and would never return. Rumors of what was happening in the village quickly spread beyond its borders. People from neighboring villages began to avoid Obili. They had heard about what had happened, and were now afraid to even go near the place. Ashalugo left behind not only destruction, but also an aura of fear that gradually spread throughout the surrounding area. No one wanted to have anything to do with the village where this strange woman with such dangerous powers lived. What was even more terrifying was that the village itself seemed to have been emptied. The residents became afraid of their own history. They could not forget what had happened. Ashalugo left behind not only physical changes in the lives of the men, but also internal changes that remained with them for many years. The men seemed to have lost something important. Fear was in their eyes, and the shadow that Ashalugo had left continued to hang over them. Every glance, every word, every step seemed to be burdened with a weight they could not shake off. But the saddest thing was that the village could not recover. Emma's mother felt that time would not bring back what had been lost. With each passing day, the village became a reminder of what had happened, a place where people lived with the memory of their destruction. This memory could not be erased because its roots ran deep in the souls of everyone. Despite their efforts to return to normal life, the women felt their hearts fill with anxiety. There was also fear in their eyes, for they had witnessed the men they loved and respected lose their strength, their souls, and with them, a part of themselves. They could no longer look at their husbands as they had before. They were filled with sympathy and fear at the same time, for they understood that their loved ones had changed beyond recognition. All that remained was regret and longing for the days when the men were strong and alive as before. The mark that Ashaluga left on the village was not easy to erase. It was too deep, and although much time had passed, the memory of it still lived on in the minds of the inhabitants of Obili. The village remained a place where inexplicable events took place, where people sought answers but never found them. All that remained in the village was memory and silence. A silence that seemed to permeate every corner, every house, every street. And in that silence there was no answer, no forgiveness, only fear and anxiety about what had been lost and what would never be restored. Despite its silence and anxiety, the village of Obili continued to exist, but its soul seemed to have left forever. The sky, which had once been bright and clear, now often looked dull, as if it too could feel the heavy atmosphere hanging over the village. The fields and forests surrounded the people as before, but they no longer brought joy. Even the sun shone, but its rays seemed too harsh and merciless, as if they were only highlighting all the pain hidden in this place. Nika, Ikena's wife, now felt that her life had taken an unknown but palpable turn. Every morning she woke up and looked at her husband with an anxiety she could not hide. Ikena, like the other men, was lost, but Nika could not bring herself to turn away from him. Despite his silent alienation, she continued to care for him as before, even though she knew that her efforts would not change him. He was lost, and his loss was not only physical. She felt that something had changed in their relationship, something that they had both lost, and nothing could bring back what was gone. His eyes no longer looked at her with the same affection and love. His gestures became cold and mechanical. He was no longer the man with whom she had built her life. The women of the village, like Nika, tried to go on with their lives, but their hearts were filled with uncertainty and pain. At some point, they began to look at each other with suspicion, as if each of them carried something dangerous inside. No one knew who to trust or who might be dangerous. The fear that Ashalugo had brought with him permeated the air, and no one could say for sure whether their lives would ever be the same again. They became afraid of even simple things: evening conversations, chance encounters on the streets, especially if there were men among them who had returned from Ashalugo. But the most frightening change was that the women began to forget how to live with their husbands. All these years they had perhaps grown accustomed to their husbands' faults, to the weaknesses that made them ordinary people, but now they did not know how to interact with the men who had returned. They were no longer the men with whom they could share joy and love, nor were they the men with whom they could even sit and talk. The women felt alienated, even from their loved ones. With each passing day, they felt a growing distance between themselves and their husbands. Sometimes even the mere presence of their husbands became a tension that was difficult to bear. But no matter how strongly the women felt, the men remained silent, consumed by their inner demons. What they had gone through left a deep wound in their souls. They couldn't express what was happening to them. Every glance in the mirror reminded them that they were broken, that they had lost something important, and couldn't get it back. And with each passing day, their silence became more and more deafening and heavy. Ikena, like many others, could no longer tell his wife about his experiences. He simply did not know how to speak, did not know how to explain to her that his soul was empty, that everything that had once filled his life had gone with Ashalugo. When the men began to feel their strength fading, that they could no longer be who they once were, they began to withdraw into themselves even more. Fear of the unknown threatened everyone. The men lost their confidence, their strength. Some of them, like Ikena, began to be tormented by guilt. He didn't know what he should be ashamed of, but still, this heavy burden weighed on his heart. Every day brought new challenges. The men could no longer look confidently to the future, because everything around them now seemed foreign. The loss in their hearts was so deep that they couldn't even admit it. It was clear to the village that a time of change had come. But what exactly these changes meant remained a mystery. The women continued their daily lives, focusing on caring for their families despite the pain, but their lives were becoming increasingly distant from what they had once been. They began to realize that they would not be able to restore the world that existed before Ashalugo. But the most important thing they had lost was the sense of peace in their hearts. The village, now a shadow of its former self, had lost the harmony that had once been its essence. Meanwhile, the village became even more isolated from the world. Visitors stopped coming from neighboring villages, the markets became empty, and a silence hung in the air that became painfully palpable. All of this indicated that something was wrong in this place. When small events took place in the village, such as weddings, harvest festivals, or gatherings, everything seemed cold and alien. People's faces smiled, but their smiles were only masks. Their eyes showed fatigue from what had been lost and could not be returned. It was not just a physical trace, it was a trace in people's souls that could not be erased. Time passed, but the memory of Ashalugo lived on in every corner of the village. All that remained of her presence was silence, a silence that no one dared to break. And although her disappearance left virtually no trace, her legacy, like a dark shadow, continued to hang over the place. The village itself is silent, its inhabitants are silent, and this silence has become its main characteristic. In the depths of this silence remains an indelible memory of what happened and of what could never be brought back.